good to be here with you all tonight. And for those of you who decided to tuck in and watch online and watch the snow fall out your window, glad to have you here as well. I had originally talked with Rob about doing a presentation really on the science and theology of dinosaurs. And I've decided to change that at the last minute, so I apologize to Rob for that. But fundamentally, we're going to be doing some of the same ideas, the same principles, because it's important to me that we understand the nature of that relationship, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But the title of my talk tonight is Beholding Behemoth, the Theology and Paleontology behind the Chief of Dinosaurs. And so what I want to accomplish tonight is just a few key things. One is I want to demonstrate the power that comes to each individual, particularly in a believer's life, when they understand how the relationship between science and theology functions. We were talking earlier this evening that so often Christians believe that science is a secular endeavor, and it is not. Science is to look at the world that God created and in turn to look beyond the creation and to see the Creator Himself. And so with that in place, that's what I'm going to be working to accomplish for us tonight, is that particular dynamic. Also, I want to exhort you, whether you're here tonight, whether you're online, is to continue to press these types of meetings, these functions, the Creation Fellowship, Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship. Keep inviting young people. Find a way to bridge what is being done here with those young people, because it's so vitally important. Because they are being impacted educationally with a worldview that is counter to Scripture and really diminishes the authority of God's Word. And I also want you just to marvel at the grandeur and majesty of God. In many respects, I want to encourage you and exhort you to worship. That when we actually stand and ponder the greatness of what God has done in creation, and specifically for us tonight, dinosaurs, we see His beautiful hand of how He has worked to bring life together. Now, as Rob talked about, the field paleontologist for the Glendive Dinosaur and Fossil Museum, that is not on the way to many things. If you wind up at the museum, you have done so on purpose. But you are always welcome. I would love to have you come up and do a dig with us. Our season runs June, July, and August. So check on our website. If you ever are up in the neighborhood, stop in and see the museum, and certainly give me a call and let me know that you're there, and I'd love to visit with you. As you walk through the museum, we have lots of casts, museum quality casts. But one of the things the Lord has blessed us with is the opportunity to have more and more fossils. Now in 2023, I get to be leading a team of excavating a full-grown Edmontosaurus, a duck-billed dinosaur. That was really cool. You see the picture there on the left with the tail section, fully articulated. That's how the tail was oriented when it was alive. And so it's kind of fascinating to actually see the relationship of the fossils together. And as you can see the picture on the right, with us just working to create field jackets. I won't get into the particulars of that, but it's an interesting process. I will say this. You might think that because we're in the ground digging up bones with dirt and rock, that you can just go to town, and actually there's quite a bit of finesse. And it's so easy to break things. And so there's a particular way we go through excavating these fossils. Now I only say that because I've observed other people breaking things, because I've never, ever broken a fossil. You did catch that, right? Okay. Now, I just want to make sure you understood. That was I tell people, I said, you're not about to do anything I haven't done 10 times over, okay? When I think about, as we press in with our talk tonight, is the Lord placed a unique thing in my heart, I think, as a child that I really didn't realize how deep it was going to get set. Now, I, like a lot of kids, enjoyed my dinosaur toys, my books. I remember Christmas morning with the latest dinosaur thing, and I was always fascinated by that. But I got to a point where I began to ask questions. I was in my mid-teens about how do dinosaurs fit into the Bible. And upon asking my pastor at that time, he had no answers. So sadly, I went away from that moment. And about 15, 18 years later, Jurassic Park came out. Now, I'm sure we've all seen Jurassic Park, and I'm not going to here to tell you that Jurassic Park answered any question that I had. But what it did is it infused, invigorated is the better word, an excitement, an anticipation, a desire to know, a recognition that questions I had when I was a teenager never got answered, and I needed to find answers. And so I got into ministries like Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and I began to recognize and see what was available. Creation science, Rob, as you were talking about that, how important this is to get our thinking anchored this way, and the Lord opened that door and opened my mind. And so years later, we've been doing this 13 years now, the Lord brought my wife and I up to Montana to fulfill a childhood dream. And now I get to serve as the field paleontologist for the museum and get to do this as part of that process to exhort, to equip, and to encourage fellow believers. Now, when you think about a paleontologist, they wear many hats. They are part biologist, where they have to understand how modern animals function, how they move, how their bones are put together. And we make study of those animals and extract relevant insights and make application to the fossils. Because we've never seen these guys walking around. We've got to figure out what do they do. And so this is a starting point for us. We have to be part geneticist. Not so much in the practice of getting into it, but just the recognition and understanding that the genetic code contains information in every living organism. Every living organism has a genetic code upon which it is built. Now think about this. Genetic code is information, and information is never a random process that just pops up out of thin air. Information is always the product of a mind, and a mind always reminds us of personhood. And what we're seeing and what we recognize here with these animals in creation is that we need the kind of mind, the personhood that transcends physical reality, that has all power, all knowledge, all capacities, and only God has that. Creation declares God as creator. We also have to be aware of our geology, the layers, how the rocks are laid out. Because most of what we're studying is the ground. We're trying to extract the fossils, but at the same time, we need to understand what's going on with the ground itself. We also have to be part engineer, and this is going to be so much the thrust of what I want to talk about tonight, is to understand the function that when we have bones, we have muscles attached, and those muscles contract to create pulling and movement. And there's such elegance that comes with that flow. And finally, there's a sense of history and theology that comes. And I find that this is really where I diverge from, if you will, a secular paleontologist. Not that a secular paleontologist doesn't have a history he pulls from, but he's created his own history. The history I pull from is the Word of God. Now, when we have a non-biblical view of history, what happens is there's an assumption that there is such a thing as prehistoric time. But what do we know from Genesis 1:1? In the beginning, God created. There's nothing that existed except God prior to that moment. What happens is when you abandon when you have a non-biblical view of history, is you have a man-created history. You see the phylogenetic tree there on the left. You have a nature-centered history where only that which is within creation, or should I say from their perspective, that which is within nature can only be used to explain itself. That's ultimately illogical. I think about the question, if you ever want to have a fun time with this question, ask third or fourth graders which came first, the chicken or the egg. And usually they shout God, but you say you can't use God for right now. And you get to hear chicken, egg, chicken, egg, chicken, egg. And I remind them that a chicken comes from an egg and an egg comes from a chicken. And we recognize the conundrum that is created there. And what that reminds us is that we need something that is outside of physical reality. A non-biblical view of history is one that has a deep time view of history. And I would tell you the Bible does not argue for that, nor does the ground, the rock record. It just doesn't. It argues for a global, catastrophic deluge. And finally, there's a naturalistic evolutionary history that's tucked into these arguments. So what we do is we recognize that a biblical view of history has us in the beginning God created. We recognize Genesis 1 as God created flyers, swimmers, land animals, crawlers, separate and unique, and he did so after their kind, and mankind came from the dust of the ground as a supernatural creation of God. We recognize that these rock layers right here, the times that you see on this chart, this is a secular view of time, but if you'll see the times, those are assigned times. Those are not discovered times. Those are not observed times. There's no test that's being run here to determine these times. These are assigned ages. And when we look and recognize the rock layers are valid, but what they represent is not deep time over millions and millions of years, but we recognize them as being phases within the Genesis flood itself. Pulses of sediment being spread across entire continents, and the water recedes a bit and another phase comes in. And that's what this actually is seen right here. If you'll notice the colors that I've got just to the right, those would be large, what we call mega sequences that are tucked within the rock layers. When nature becomes man's God, Jesus Christ is rejected as the true agent of creation. And ultimately, that's really the battle, isn't it? That's really where the battle is. Nature becomes the substitute agent of creation. Now, I recognize we should intuitively recognize that nature is not a thing. It's not an entity. It is merely a concept to describe something else. But it has no causal power within itself. And to view nature as an agent of creation is idolatry. Paul reminded the Romans, as we read in Romans chapter 1, I believe it's right around verses 20 through 25. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Not worshiping God and recognizing who he was as creator, they in turn worship what? The creation. So when we set the Bible as a history book of the universe, and we build our theology, our understanding, our historic framework with this idea, John 1:3, all things came into being through him, being Jesus Christ. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. Colossians 1 reminds us that Jesus Christ, at the very end there, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Jesus Christ is the sustainer of all things. So we recognize that Jesus Christ is before all things. He is the creator of all things. He is the sustainer of all things. And he is the transcendent presence and power who reigns over creation. For me, these are non-negotiables. These become anchor points in my thinking. And while these may be rehearsals, reminders, basics that you've already got in your mind, it is upon this foundation that I build what I'm going to work through this evening. The biblical narrative in Dinosaurs. Let's look at Job 40, and this is where I want to really settle in and walk through with you for the next little bit this evening. Job 40. Behold now Behemoth, which I made along with you. It eats grass like an ox. Behold now, its power is in its loins, and its vigor in the muscles of its belly, and it hangs its tail like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are knit together. Its bones are tubes of bronze. Its limbs are like bars of iron. It is the first of the ways of God. Let its maker bring near its sword. This verse 15 that I want to highlight just for a moment here is really pivotal right here, because what is being said and being communicated here is God is saying to Job, you see the great creature over there, we're calling Behemoth. I made him. And because I made him, I have authority over him. But I also made you, Job. God made you and us and you online, which means he has what? He also has authority over our lives, doesn't he? So when we recognize that God is the cause for a thing, we recognize that, as Dr. Galuza points out, causality is linked to credit, and credit is linked to glory. When you think about that, what we're dealing with with respect to creation science, in defending the Word of God and trying to understand science rightly and walk in that, this is so much of the nature of the battle that we're fighting here. There are a few things I want to also point out here in this Job 40 passage. We see the couplets here, verses 16, 17, and 18. And if you'll notice, each verse is 2 lines, and each line is referencing a similar concept or idea, but from 2 different perspectives. And so we kind of get a little bit broader sense of what is being communicated, what it is that God wants Job to see and to understand. And so the Hebrew narrative, the way the text is written, fleshes this out this way. The text also is written here as a highlight for Behemoth on one level, because God did not just come to Job and just pick any animal. He is picking this particular animal, this particular and unique animal. But what God is saying is, there's something more I want you to see, is the animal brings glory to me, but I am the focal point of this passage here. And so when I think about Behemoth being a sauropod, and I apply the text of Job 40, this is how I see the text. As a Christian, as a student of Scripture, as a paleontologist, I merge these concepts, and this is how I unpack the text. So what is Behemoth? Let's walk through this. Well, first of all, the book of Job is full of many animals. And as we look through and make our way into chapters 38 through 41, we run a series of animals from 38 right up to Job 40:15, talking about Behemoth. Now, many people say that Behemoth is not a real animal. It's a mythological creature. But for me, the flow of the text is giving us a series of known animals, and it seems an odd place to transition to a mythological creature when all of them preceding it have been known creatures. And so when we look at the word Behemoth, what we're looking at is Behemoth is the plural form of Behemah. And so we go to Genesis chapter 1 and we see that word Behemah. Why? I guess what I'm seeing here in Job 40 is that God seems to be referencing a particular animal. And so why would we use the plural form? And I believe it may be because there is a superlative sense about this animal. When we look at the text of Job 40, it gives us some key anatomical features. In fact, I really think it's interesting here. For a text, it's fairly comprehensive in the anatomy of this animal, and it even gives us some biomechanical life movement insights here. And so these are the things we're kind of looking for. And when I take this comprehensive list and kind of create my own possible scenarios other than Behemoth, just to kind of process, am I missing something here? It's a good student to think through and consider other perspectives. Well, the Komodo dragon and the crocodile, they certainly have the tail that might qualify, but they don't have the legs. They just don't. And these other animals, you might argue for their legs. The tails just don't cut it, does it? When you have a tail that sways like a cedar tree, I think the hippo is really the best example. If somebody told you that hippos didn't have a tail, you wouldn't be surprised. I mean, they do, but you just don't see them. So I don't think that any of those animals fit our criteria. And I think Behemoth is a sauropod. Now in that, I want to press us into seeing what's going on here, because if you remember my fourth point regarding being a paleontologist is thinking like an engineer. And so I see the tail being anchored into the hips provides particular movement and balance for the animal. It helps it function well. The legs that are up under the hips actually help the animal move well for its size. And the vertebrae have a particular size in them as you go from the base of the skull to the tip of the tail. They're always changing some. And they've got large groups, the neck, between the shoulders and the hip, at the hips, in the tail. There's a certain feature that each one has that reminds me of engineering principles that are being put into place. And when we think about engineering, I think about the concepts, if you see the list there, of foresight and purpose and design, complexity, taking integrated systems, that as an engineer, you're thinking through in advance, I've got an end goal that I'm trying to meet, but how am I going to get there? God didn't just throw things at Behemoth and say, I hope it works out. But out of the infinite mind that he had, he designed Behemoth to function and be perfectly suited as God had intended. I find it interesting, we live in a world today where the mechanical hand on the left, no one would argue was designed and engineered. And yet the hand on the right, most of the world would argue what? That it evolved over millions of years, didn't it? And I find that so illogical and irrational. Something else is going on, isn't there? Behemoth, a marvel of God's handiwork. When we think of size with the behemoth, with the sauropods, I'm going to begin to change my terminology here. Sauropods, to say they're biggest is kind of not hitting the mark as precise as I would like. But they are the longest, they are the tallest, and they are the heaviest of any land animal that has ever lived. They check all the boxes. And what I'm reminded of is that being big is a big deal. When I think about one of them in this room here and how they would just fill this room up and dominate this room. Here is Dippy, the Diplodocus, 85 feet long. This is in the Field Museum, the Field House in Utah. This is in Wyoming at the Dinosaur Center. Jumbo is 106 feet long. And in the Field Museum in Chicago, Maximo was 122 feet long. 122 feet long. In fact, there have been portions of bones of sauropods that would even suggest even longer animals. They are truly magnificent in their size. And I thought, just to entertain myself, maybe you too, I'd run an airplane by and just kind of see how they could stack up against an airplane. 737 jet. And you can see the size. Truly massive animals. But it got me thinking, with respect to size, I can see what the text is arguing for, but how does the secular paleontologist view size? I've got 3 slides here that I'm going to read that are going to be really important to kind of set the tone here. The never since surpassed size of the largest dinosaurs remains unexplained. Dinosaur giantism is a scientific problem that has puzzled biologists since the earliest discoveries of sauropod dinosaur bones almost 160 years ago. Sauropods are the ultimate outgroup among terrestrial vertebrates, simply because of their size. Their vast dimensions and sheer existence in the history of life help us to evaluate any potential limits of body size in terrestrial vertebrates. Whereas many other life forms can fit comparatively easily within existing frameworks, sauropods appear so far out of the range that they are a definite challenge. No other group of terrestrial vertebrates has ever reached such a size. Because the advantage of a large body size applies to terrestrial vertebrates in general, the obvious question haunting life scientists is, what factors allow the sauropods and the sauropods alone to become so large? Now here's a secular paleontologist recognizing that for sauropods to be as big as they are, they're defying logic and they're not really sure how to explain best how they got as big as they are. My answer is quite simple. It's because God created sauropods to do what they do so that they might bring Him glory. The largest animal that we can think of that's ever lived is the blue whale. And while its weight is quite a bit more than the dinosaur, the sauropod, and its length is comparable, I'm thinking skeletal-wise, how much of that skeleton is dedicated to supporting its own weight? And you stop and think about it. If that animal were beached and on the shore, what would it be doing to get itself back into the water? Nothing. And so to me, this is what's kind of fascinating about the sauropods, is their length and size and weight is really quite profound, and yet they're walking around, active, moving. And so being big is a big deal. Now the Rubik's Cube, I've got this here not so we can figure out if we can fix this. I know some of you are like, I can do that. But I'll use it to kind of give you a sense. You'll see the one in the upper left-hand corner. I'm calling that a 2 cube, or cube 2, which means you'll see 2 across. If you look at the blue face, there's a 2 by 2. So when we think about surface area versus volume, surface area would be 2 times 2 is 4, and how many sides are there? There's 6, so you've got 24, right? But if you're going to go volume, you go 2 times 2 times 2. And so you recognize that at this point, the volume is much less than the surface area. As you begin to get up higher, up to 216, you begin to recognize that's cube 6, they begin to match. But notice when they move beyond cube 6, and you start working your way up 7, 8, 9, and 10. Surface area incrementally increases, but volume does what? Exponentially increases. And so something else is going on here. And so when we see the biggest of the dinosaurs, it's not just a larger version of the juveniles. It's something else that's going on. And the stresses on its body systems, its joints, its feet, its heart, its cardiovascular system is profound. And so as it gets bigger, it gets harder. In fact, we see that in humans. The bracket is basically pounds per inch, and you go all the way up. I was even thinking about with Robert Wadlow, while his pound per inch is higher than anybody else. If he were an athletic man, I bet he would weigh well over 500 pounds because he doesn't look to have much muscle mass, which would even make that number all the more important. Now, when we think about sauropods and how they move, we're looking at the mechanics of life, the function of life, and this size thing is important, but how do they move? And so we want to study how living organisms move. And they do so through a broad range of things. It's part of what we look at in the Genesis 1 narrative when God creates flyers, swimmers, and land animals. Each one has their own unique function of movement. So what I want to do is take just a few minutes to evaluate a couple of known modern examples, and then we'll take a look at the sauropod. I love watching the cheetah run every time I run this up here. It is an amazing creature to watch it stride. Now, it gets its speed by quickness and by length of stride. And what we see here, we'll begin to evaluate certain aspects of its weight, its body plan, breathing capacity. We recognize it's designed to run like it does. And we can see that. If we look at an elephant, they don't stride out very far, do they? Now, they have a decent amount of speed for their size, but they're doing it by the quickness of their gait. But if you'll notice their legs, they don't get their legs out from underneath their torsos very much, do they? They could not ever run like the cheetah, and if they ever tried, they would be on the ground. So what we can look at is we see from a skeletal standpoint, a body plan standpoint, they're built for size and strength, aren't they? Now, when we think about land animals generally have the same basic body features. Head, neck, torso, 4 limbs of some kind, often a tail, even when we compare the skeletons of the cheetah and the elephant. If I told you you had to pick out which one has a head, a neck, ribs, 4 legs, and a tail, which one would I be talking about? Either one of them, couldn't it? So what distinguishes the two are the proportions of the skeleton and the unique individual attributes. And so I think an elephant gives us actually some more relevant insights to sauropods than the cheetah would. I'm going to try and go see him tomorrow. This is what I think we're looking at here, and you can begin to recognize the bigger proportions within the skeleton himself. And we begin to look at these dimensions, the attributes. We see an animal in the sauropod built for what? Power and strength, not speed and quickness. Now, when we see the animal being engineered from the ground up, I want to walk through just some key features to highlight some things for you as we begin to think about the early days of paleontology and how they viewed dinosaurs was very reptilian. Legs sprawled out, dragging their tails, crawling around on their bellies. But functionally, this would have never worked for a sauropod. I even think about the early paleo artist Charles Knight, and there's a little bit of that still that crouched stance tucked into this picture. And notice where the tail is. It's dragging the ground. And so this was the concept that was rooted in front of us for many years. As you begin to look at things like feet, begin to see something more active going on here. These are the front feet right here, and the metatarsals are oriented almost vertically, much like you would see in an elephant. And so they probably had ligaments strapped around their metatarsals to help hold them together, and they were good at weight bearing. These are the hind feet, and you'll see the shorter the other one was metacarpals. These are metatarsals here. And you'll see the hind feet would have had something else going on to help support the weight. They would have had probably a little cushion at the heel. I'll show you more about that in just a second. This is Maximo from the Chicago Museum, and these are pictures of the feet. The left is the front feet, and you'll see once again how vertically oriented they are. Really ideally designed for load-bearing capacity. The hind feet have these odd-shaped claws that could help for locomotion, pushing forward, could possibly be for digging. It appears that their muscle attachments would have had a similar effect as if we were to crunch our toes together, is that they would have drawn them in but also flattened and turned them. Dr. David Norman talks about this idea of a kind of an elastic ball in the heel. He makes the point here in this quote that Usain Bolt, the great track star, is running on the balls of his feet. And what he's doing is he's not running up and down, but he's running very smoothly. And so that creates a high level of efficiency for his movement forward. And so elephants have an elastic ball in their heel to help with efficiency as they step. And the thinking is that sauropods would have had the same thing. How do we know that? We don't have any fossil evidence of that. But we can go to their tracks. And we can recognize where the toes would be, but we can also recognize the shape of the impression. And it's a very oval shaped, which tells us that there was something more in the bottom of the foot than just the bones themselves. These are some more tracks right here. I actually find trackways just as fascinating as the skeletons, because the skeletons are really cool. But with the trackways, you're getting a sense that the animal was alive and it's moving. And you get something totally different, even without having any bones. As we make our way up, and I was talking about this earlier with the elephants, the importance when they ran of keeping their legs under them, the sauropods would have been positioned that same way. In fact, it's interesting when you read Job 40, verse 18, it says, its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs are like bars of iron. It's actually suggesting in the biblical narrative something that paleontologists are now recognizing was a necessity of movement. This is the inside of a bone. I just ran into this just a few weeks ago. And you'll see that it's not hollow, it's a very solid bone. The compact bone is the darker ring around the outside, and then you have a spongy bone on the inside. Actually, this is partially agatized, which is why it's orange there. Now let me walk through here a few things with respect to seeing the sauropod as a bridge with the vertebra, because we're now moved from our feet up through the legs, up to the back. Engineers are always thinking about planning and anticipating. Bridge engineers need to know how to carry loads and stresses. Arch bridges show patterns of engineering. So when we see an arch bridge, we see the curve. We can almost infer a triangle in its load-bearing capacity. Each one has its load that drops right down through the middle. That the stresses would want the bridge to collapse into the middle of itself. When we take that same shape, arch bridge, and apply a sauropod to it, we see that from the hips to the shoulders, there's a slight arch. And so that portion of the torso functions like an arch bridge. Center of mass is right in front of the hips, and you see the triangle that we can draw from that with a load-bearing capacity. A suspension bridge is another way to see the sauropods, where we recognize that the cables help carry the load, and the towers are tall to help maximize the usefulness of the cables themselves. So all the weight is being driven down through these towers. And I was thinking, if we start putting a bunch of these towers together and overlaid that on a dinosaur, these are spinous processes, part of the vertebra that stand up from up above. And what happens is there are ligaments that span each vertebra, which would be the same thing as the cables on the bridge. On the Diplodocus, the double beam structure, actually there's two ligaments. And so the muscle isn't having to work to keep the neck and the tail up, but there are ligaments that are helping to keep things rigid and tight. Here's another picture, another angle, and you'll see the ligaments, how they would have run across the back. So we actually can look at a sauropod's torso, hips, and shoulders and overlay two bridges that we can recognize that what's going on here is there's an arch bridge that helps with the weight of the gut, of the center of mass right there. And when it moves, the suspension bridge function helps keep everything in place. I've got this also in here just to kind of give you another sense of what movement and shape is going on. As you see the triangle right at the hips for the T-Rex, and it kind of teeters on that hip movement right there. When you look at a cantilever, which is simply just a span, you've got the tower of the vertical member there of the tower, and it extends out with a boom for a cantilever. And what keeps that cantilever, that boom arm in place, are cables that help support it. And so we begin to look at a sauropod, and we have like a double cantilever working on each end of the animal. And you begin to see the structure and the engineering built into these animals. So as we think about this dual cantilever, what benefit is there? If you're going to extend out in the front and extend in the back, you want the load to be supported, but you also want the load to be lighter. When we think about looking at the head, sauropods do not have very big heads. Typically they're no bigger than a horse's head, which is kind of odd for a 50-ton animal. So small skull is important. They also have air sacs in the neck vertebra and even into the torso. So they're not just solid bones, but there are individual pockets that would have been spots for air sacs to actually place in the bone themselves to help lighten the load here. Matthew Weddell here talks about the importance. He says sauropods were marvels of biological engineering, and that efficiency of design is especially evident in their vertebra. The bones that make up the backbone, the center or bodies of the vertebra, may have deep pits or large holes that open into internal chambers. These laminae and cavities are often considered to be adaptations to lighten the animal by reducing its mass. And so as you look here at this right here, this was in Thermopolis, Wyoming, was through here just recently. And this is a actual neck vertebra on display, and you see the openings where air sacs would have been. Here's one on display. Here's the Burpee Museum in Rockford, Illinois, and again you see the openings in the vertebra. This helps lighten the load. When you think about what this gives us in the small head is not really there for chewing. It's not a chewing adaptation function. It is a vegetation gathering function. It's actually just consuming vegetation and swallowing it. And Job 40 reminds us, behold now Behemoth, which I made with you, he eats grass like an ox. They're vegetarians. And so when you look at their teeth, the Diplodocus in particular have teeth out at the front who are stripping vegetation all the way through. They're not using their jaws to chew anything. They're swallowers. And so they're attentive to their size, is they would have locked in probably in key spots and just stood while their necks just span across blankets of vegetation and just consume vegetation. Now, the eating is not the only thing they do. They've got to drink. And so one of the things that's important is when they drink, when their heads go down, and I know all of us have had this in life, when you bend over and stand up quickly, anybody ever hit the floor? And so the sauropod, you think about that, he's taking his head from up high and dropping it down low to drink water, and then he's going to raise it back up. At some point, he's going to run into a problem, unless he's got some systems built in, engineered by God for him to function well. One of the things would be simply is that he would need a large heart. Now this is a blue whale heart. I was thinking about what big hearts are there in the world. This is an actual heart. A blue whale did beach itself. Marine biologist extracted the heart and prepped it and put it on display. And you can see here, it pumps 58 gallons per beat. That doesn't even make sense. I hear the number, I can recognize it, but it just doesn't make sense. Another thing that the sauropods would have necessarily had that we see in giraffes. Giraffes have certain features, valves within the neck, within the base of the skull, tightness around their ankles, their lower legs like compression socks, to help regulate blood flow. While we don't have fossil evidence, this would have been a necessary feature for the sauropods. The tail, which is kind of where I want to land us, because if you remember here, Job 40 says, "Behold now, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar." Now remember when I first began to hear that, process that, I thought, that's got to be a sauropod. What I recognize now is while that is true, there's so much more that's going on here that's important. When you think about the tail is anchored into the base of the hips. The hips function like a buttress. And so the tail is a cantilever. While it's flexible, it's a cantilever. If you were to take that tail and divide it up into 7 sections, the first 2 sections would serve as kind of an anchor point. They would often be fused or still very big and very tightly bound together. But it's that last 5/7 of the tail that has lots of movement. It's that last 5/7 of the tail that in particular, I think the passage of Job 40 is referring to. Now what they find here sometimes is something called diffuse idiopathic skeletal I knew I was going to mess up that last word, hyperostosis. And this is the idea of the bones being fused as a natural function, not as a pathogen or a disease, but actually a designed feature God would have placed within the animal himself. And you begin to recognize how the base of the tail serves with strength. Now when I think about this Job 40 passage, I think of trees being blown in the wind and how the base of the tree really anchors itself into the ground. But as the breeze blows across the tops of the trees, there's a swaying action that's going on. So why am I bringing this? Why is this relevant? Well, if you think about a sauropod as walking, and the Bible tells us that the tail is swayed, what action is happening here? Well, what we have is a muscle that attaches to the back of the femur and runs and flows into the tail. It's called a caudal-femoralis longus. There's a picture of it. And in order for that dinosaur to get forward movement, he needs to have one of his femurs drawn back. The contraction of the muscle. So if I want to step forward as a behemoth, I'm going to take my left step. That means my left caudal-femoralis is going to contract, and then it's going to release as my right caudal-femoralis contracts. Making sense? When that happens, there's a residual energy that would show up in the tail, so that as the animal is walking, the tail sways. He's not whacking it like a dog. I think what the Job 40 passage is telling us is that Behemoth is simply walking. He's seeing it move. And so while the tail is fascinating by itself, its movement and its integration into the hips is really quite intriguing. So we see here the Job 40 passage really giving us some beautiful insights. A couple of more slides that I want to just share with you, kind of some thoughts to kind of leave with you. First of all, dinosaurs existed to bring God glory. As we discover more about dinosaurs, the more we are reminded about God's incredible creative power. God gave us the desire and ability to know He exists by spreading His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, all over creation for us to discover. The more we learn about creation, the more we learn about its creator. a closer examination of dinosaurs will naturally lead us to see the hand of God all the more. One of the things that we can kind of get caught in is we sometimes look at the Earth's history as a thing that happened in the past. The rock layers, the flood, the fact that the fossils are in the ground and these animals died. But I believe that God is the one who instigated the flood as a result and a response to man's sin. And that the flood is not some rogue, random geological event, but it is God judging the sin of humanity. And so what I want to encourage you to do is when you think about dinosaurs, think about them in terms of looking at a mirror. It's the fact that they're dead is as a result of our sin.